recording. And let me once again welcome everyone to today's online event, Conservation Philanthropy. This event is sponsored by the Conservation Finance Innovation Network and the Government Innovators Network. And let me turn things over to today's moderator, Jim Levitt, the director of the program on conservation innovation at the Harvard Forest.
Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to have you all here. I can see from the roster on my computer screen that there are people who I'm very familiar with and people who I have yet to meet. So I love the mix and the fact that the audience continues to grow. Hello, Carter Wall and Carolyn Friedman and Lynn Leifert and Forrest Berkeley, and even Pat Cody, who was our guest at the previous installation of this series. Let me remind you that the recordings of these expert chats on conservation finance can be found both on the Government Innovators Network as well as the Conservation Finance Innovation Network. And Jim Cooney, if you can click on the CFI network site just briefly. We'll see if that comes up quickly. You will see on the front page of this website that there is a bar on the left-hand side that says Expert Chats. Jim, if you click on Expert Chats right there, you come to a page where you have today's session listed and described, and then below that, I believe there's a second listing of the interview that we had with Pat Cody and Ian Johnson in November of 2007. Over time, as we do this 3 or 4 times a year, we will have quite a collection of interesting expert chats that you can use at your leisure. So with that brief introduction, let me tell you what we're going to talk about today. We're focusing on innovations in conservation philanthropy. We try in these shows to both focus on a U.S. case study and on an example of an initiative that's going on outside the United States, internationally. And so we're very lucky today to have 2 guests. The first, Tom Curren, will talk for about 10 or 15 minutes about a conservation initiative in the Northeast United States. And then he will be followed by Gowher Rizvi, who will talk about the need for conservation innovation and linking that to basic human needs philanthropy in the developing world. Let me start by introducing Tom Curren. Tom grew up in Melrose, Massachusetts, not 20 miles from where we are sitting right now. He attended both the University of Massachusetts and Dartmouth and started his career in social work. He has wonderful experience and stories about running an inner-city scholarship program in Roxbury, Massachusetts, and then made a switch in the middle of his career to conservation, heading up the Lakes Region Conservation Trust in New Hampshire, where he had a particularly successful career pushing people well beyond where they thought they might want to go to save very important and large pieces of land in the state to our north. Tom has now started an initiative at the Pew Charitable Trust that he will tell us about that is again challenging people to see beyond where they thought they might want to go to begin with, to conserve vast tracts of land, what we call landscape scale conservation initiatives, as well as smaller ones in New England. So with that, let me turn it to Tom. I am going to conduct this part of the conversation interactively with Tom. So let me start, Tom, by just asking you, how did you get involved in this field?
Well, I think I was predisposed from both my parents and my experiences in Melrose. Growing up by the Middlesex Falls Reservation, which is an early preservation area. But as you mentioned, my career was largely in special education and in inner city issues. And I was asked to volunteer for a land trust, and ultimately that piqued my interest so much that I ended up taking a staff position as the executive director of the Lakes Region Conservation Trust.
And at the Lakes Region, you started off small and very quickly got big. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, it was an interesting time, Jim. It was during the end of a recessionary period when land prices were low. and a point where the financial markets had recovered somewhat. And the donor base were people who largely were from Boston and were interested in protecting land in central New Hampshire. So primarily, I think, using some social work skills, I got to know who the landowners were of the priority parcels, got a sense of what their needs were and their aspirations for the land, and then began to broker a conservation outcome between the landowners and the donor community and the organization I worked for, the trust and its trustees. And we were able to do quite a bit in a relatively short amount of time.
So you started out small, and as you have told me, a proposition came by your land trust to do a project that was greater than $1 million in value. And somebody made a dare, put a dare out on the table that I think was particularly instructive to you. Do you want to tell us about that?
Sure, and I think that's illustrative of some of the bedrock values in conservation here in New England especially. I remember we had a $6 million capital campaign up and running. This was in just after 9/11, so things were a little rough in terms of raising money. And a second parcel, a really important parcel, came up for available on Swan Lake, and we had to come up with some money. And we had to get a relatively small number of people excited about this. And so we had a gathering at a donor's house, and we were hoping to get some responses from people in the room. And I gave a pep talk about why the land was worth protecting. You could see it out the window. And then asked if there were any questions. And of course, the host was going to do the ask on the attendees after I finished the question and answer period. And someone said, a newcomer to the area said, well, what happens if you fail to raise this money? And I was, as I told you, I was trying to come up with a non-glib answer to that because I didn't intend to fail. When an older gentleman here from Boston, a very well-known philanthropist, raised his hand and stood up and said, excuse me, if this project doesn't come to a success, it's not this gentleman's failure, it's our failure as a community. And that's why wife and I are pledging $150,000. And we hope, Jim, that you will too. And at that point, I looked to the host of the event to see if he wanted to complete any remarks, and he just shook his head. And actually, my wife, Kathy, passed out the pledge cards, and we finished the campaign. So that's more of the, I think that was indicative to me of that kind of bedrock. If the need is there, people will jump at it locally. And as you know, some of this philanthropy is, particularly in land, is generations. You mentioned to me that one of the heads of the trustees of reservations at one point gave a speech that was consistent with the principles that his, I guess, how many generations?
13th great-grandfather.
Yeah, had talked about back when he was in power and here in what was then the Bay Colony. So we have a really strong basis in conservation here in this region.
So I will say that I know Tom's referring to the example set by the Winthrop family, and I've written about that before, but I have to agree that New England, for a lot of reasons, is kind of an exemplar in conservation philanthropy that's shown the way throughout the United States and increasingly around the world. But let me turn this back to you, Tom. I know that as you concluded your career at the Lakes region, you had an inspiration to kind of raise your hand in the middle of a virtual meeting and challenge other people to follow your example, and that's really how you got this initiative, the Northeast Land Trust Consortium, started at the Pew Charitable Trust. Can you tell us a little bit about how that entity came into being?
Well, that basically came out of the $6 million campaign that I spoke of earlier. That was a tough slog. Raising that kind of money post 9/11 was difficult. We raised that almost completely from private individuals here in the Northeast. And let me also just say parenthetically, that same New England tradition of conservation and over the history of the Northeast was very, very strong in New York as well, with the Adirondacks and conservation in the Hudson Valley, and also in Pennsylvania, Gifford Pinchot and others, and the creation of a wonderful network of preserved lands in Pennsylvania. So having finished that campaign, and in my previous life working with inner city students, having depended upon foundations to assist, I was struck by the opportunity for foundations to play a larger role in domestic conservation that they had been playing heretofore. And that's when I met with folks at Pew, a gentleman named Steve Kallick of the Environment Department, and talked to them about a way in which Pew could, through use of a challenge grant mechanism, assist in what is really realizing some enormous opportunities here in the Northeast now. And that was the beginning of this project.
And so what is the project now, and how has it grown just over the first year or two of its existence?
Well, the project started out as a pilot project of the Pew Charitable Trust, and then we did a renewal. And now we're going in for the third approval of it, and if all goes forward as we hope it will no longer be a pilot project. And we basically thought that we would look at funding, assisting, and partners with land trusts in the Northeast that were doing really good work and trying to create a portfolio of projects that, as you suggested, are both landscape quality but also the smaller ones, so that we would have projects that were not only important for their own right but also indicative of other projects, so that to the donor population we're not only supporting individual projects, in this case the New England Forestry Foundation, the Appalachian Mountain Club, the Trustees of Reservations, Lakes Region Conservation Trust, and the Maine Coast Heritage Trust, but also really showcasing the type of work that's being done throughout the Northeast. And it's been a lot of work. It's taken a lot of miles, taken a lot of work on my part and my associates in Philadelphia, Tracy Mack and Sarah Lancaster. But we've been honored to have a hand in the protection of just under 400,000 acres thus far, and meet some wonderful donors and wonderful organizations, and hopefully to play a part in the advancement of the land trust movement here in America, particularly in the Northeast.
So one more question before we move to Gowher. Your involvement is not only in challenge grants that help protect land, but also in capacity building for the land trust community in New England. That is, you're building both the land base and the capability of people who are going to protect that land. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. By its nature, we're not going to be able to do everything for all people. We're again trying to protect a finite amount of land with a finite amount of resources. So we're working with land trusts and with donors through contributions to these organizations' missions, and also to donor-advised funds. But in addition, we're aware that, as you and I talked about before, the land trust movement really is relatively young, but it needs to become mature and strong and ultimately become the equivalent of the university sector or the library sector or museum sector, because these parcels are gems and community resources that need to be maintained and available to the public for generations. And so these organizations need to mature and not only do the work they're doing now, which they're doing an incredibly good job, but also look at fitting themselves for perpetuity, which is a big word. It's a word that Harvard's pulled off pretty well thus far. But that we have to look at even these small organizations, looking ahead as far, say, as the history of Harvard, that 300, 400 years from now, these parcels still need to be kept for the benefit of wildlife and also for the benefit of the public. So we're working with the Land Trust Alliance and some very dedicated donors to also see that there's a higher level of professionalism and resources available to these land trusts throughout the Northeast.
Okay, Tom, thank you very much. I just want to note that this is a good example, Tom's story, of an innovation in conservation, as we like to try to think about it at the Ash Institute for Democratic Governance and Innovation at the Kennedy School and also at the Harvard Forest. That is, there was some novelty or creativity in the creation of this initiative. Tom had to raise his hand and write a letter and get people moving on this. It has been measurably effective, It is strategically significant to a number of land conservation initiatives in New England. It is transferable, that is, other region-wide conservation initiatives throughout the United States and other parts of the world are taking notes and copying some of the techniques that Tom has been using. And as Tom just pointed out, it at least has the ambition to endure for a very long time, and I think particularly when we're talking about conservation, endurance is a very, very important attribute. Now with that, let me turn to the director of the Ash Institute for Democratic Governance and Innovation at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government for the last 6 years, a highly esteemed colleague, Gowher Rizvi, who was born in Bangladesh, which was then part of India, was educated at Oxford University and taught at Oxford for 22 years, then took a position with the Ford Foundation as its program officer in India, and has come to the Kennedy School to run the Ash Institute for the past 6 years. Gowher has announced recently that he is about to take yet another chapter in his life and move to Dubai, where he will be the head of a very large philanthropic initiative that he can describe. But Gowher is particularly relevant to our discussion here because he can take what Tom has talked about in conservation in New England and apply that to the very different set of circumstances that you find in places like Bangladesh, which are facing huge challenges in conservation and environmental quality from a number of factors, including global warming. So Gowher, with that, let me turn it over to you.
Thank you, Jim. But let me first put on record that unlike Jim or Tom Curren or Matt Zypa, I am not an expert in conservancy or environment issues, although I have an interest in this subject. By way of introduction, let me also say that the Ash Institute is really engaged in trying to make governments more effective. And of course, one of the areas where we try to make governments more effective is on the question of environment. And it is people like Tom Curren, who are great innovators, whom we celebrate, whom we recognize, and it is their work that we try and disseminate. So for me, it is truly a privilege to be in the same company as Tom. Having said that this is not my area, I do want to emphasize that probably environment is one of those real area, one of those great global challenges that affects the North and the South equally. And therefore, when we are discussing about conservation, about environmental issues, even though this discussion is focused largely on the Northeast and the United States, we cannot forget what is happening in the developing world. And in many senses, ironically, even though the North has contributed much more to the pollution and environmental degradation, today South is carrying a lot of the brunt of this degradation. And not only the South, it is the poor in the South who are most affected. Most recently, there was a survey of children who live on the streets of New Delhi. The amount of fume that they consume on a day is equivalent to smoking 2 packets of cigarettes, about 40 cigarettes a day. Such is the impact, and yet the poor have no role whatsoever in contributing to this pollution. So I really think when we are talking about conservation philanthropy, we need to also talk about environmental justice, environmental equity, and the need to bring the North and the South together in a dialogue. Of course, there is a widespread view in the South to which I do not entirely agree, and that is that people are so much struggling to make their livelihood, to find a way of surviving, that questions of environmental conservation, etc., is a luxury that which they cannot easily indulge in. I recognize the importance of livelihood. I recognize that the people are struggling to survive, but I don't think these two are mutually exclusive. Sustainable development requires a concern for conservation. So even those of us who are those of you who are participating from the South, I hope you will focus on this issue, that these are not mutually exclusive. We need to think both about conservation and about sustainable development simultaneously. Now, as Jim said, I come from Bangladesh, and for me, this challenge is not simply an academic challenge. In the event of a slight global warming, a third of Bangladesh will be underwater. Our neighboring country, the Maldives, will be completely submerged. So it is really a matter of life and death for us, those of us who live in that part of the world. And it is very important that we address these questions together. And this can only be done as the way we try to do at the Ash Institute. We have learned from experience that it is only when knowledge is built through a two-way exchange of ideas and experiences between the North and the South, between scholars and practitioners. So I hope this group that we have together today will be able to think of ways in which we can solve and address some of these problems. Although what I have so far said sounds somewhat pessimistic, and I am worried, but I am not pessimistic. There are numerous stories which I'll be glad to share with you where there have been great successes in addressing these problems in the South as well.
Well, Gowher, let me ask you if you could give us any thoughts that you have as you take your new position in Dubai of what kind of philanthropy might be effective in addressing issues in places like Bangladesh, where they are facing catastrophic losses of land and millions of people's lives are being impacted by something that we can see coming right down the road at us.
I think, Jim, the first thing and a sad thing to acknowledge is that philanthropy in developing countries have not yet addressed seriously the question of conservation. It is still way lower questions of health, about education, livelihood, poverty, obviously occupies a much higher. However, there are some interesting movements which are addressing this issue in a slightly different way. Let me talk about two issues. One is increasingly people now realize that the problem is best solved by people who are actually dealing with the problem. In other words, people who actually live with the problem. For instance, much of South Asia, which was at one point had thick forests, is now largely denuded of forests. Not even a fraction of the forest is left today. Now, one very creative response here was to return the forest to the forest users, people who earn their livelihood through forests, through the joint forestry management. What this has meant is, because to the forest dwellers who depend on the forest for their livelihood, it is not simply a forest is not simply about timbers. It is about their livelihood, and for that reason they have a stake in preserving the forest, so all the largesse and all the various products that forests provide can survive. It has taken the government many years to realize, and slowly they are now beginning to turn back the forest, albeit deforested areas, to the community, so that they can harness it, they can nurture it, and they can bring the forest back. There's another remarkable story in Rajasthan. where the river Ara Valley, which some 30 years ago had completely dried, the neighboring areas had become a desert. A number of NGOs came along. A young man by the name of Rajendra Singh popped up, and he basically used very mundane technique of check dams with a small grant from the Ford Foundation to recharge the water table by stopping the flow of water, water flowing away and evaporating. So, in other words, there are wonderful techniques available, dedicated men and women who are doing this great job, and with a little help from the North, some ideas from the South, help and ideas from the North, and cooperation of the South, I do think we can reverse much of it.
Thank you so much for that. I am going to now turn the program to questions. We have Matt Zeiper from the Trust for Public Land with us today in the studio, and Matt's going to start out the questions. I see that there are some 70 of you in the audience who I know many of you are quite loquacious and ask wonderful questions. So please start putting your questions into the question area of your screen, and we will try to field them from this end as best we can. But first, let me turn to Matt Zeiper for the first several questions. Matt.
Great. Thanks, Jim, and thank you to Tom and Gowher for an excellent presentation at the beginning this morning. The first question I have is for Tom Curren, and I wanted to just get a little more specific on what are the types of characteristics that describe the projects that you're supporting, both the organizations and the types of land, and then maybe what doesn't make the cut for funding from the consortium and why?
That's a very good question, and we are looking at 5 areas of endeavor with the lands that we support, the projects we support. The first is the protection of wilderness and old-growth areas where they exist now. That's clearly a priority. The biological value of those types of areas is something we don't even understand yet. The second is areas that are being forest managed, areas that are being managed for forestry. And I had to when Gowher was discussing, mentioning the impact of deforestation upon local populations. The same cohort is in Maine, in the forest. It's among the communities there, the loggers, the people who deal with large forest products. And in the Hudson Valley of New York, farmers that want to see their land used correctly. So I think the working landscape is important as well. The third area would be areas that are important recreationally. For example, where the Appalachian Mountains Club or the trustees of reservations are working. A fourth area is agricultural land. We don't yet know how important our remaining agricultural lands are here in the Northeast. And with changing energy issues, we need to reconnect with our food supply here. And the fifth one is the area where land has a cultural value, has a value to the ways of life that depend upon the land. If a community is a farming community and the farms all turn to parking lots and strip malls, then that way of life is gone. And we want to see that that's an important conservation value as well, the folklore of these lands. As far as what doesn't make the cut, we can only do a small percentage of what's out there, where there are examples of projects that we haven't been able to fund, where we try to play at least a resource role in helping people see where they might raise funds as well. So it's not so much something that's disqualified. It's more a matter of limited resources.
Great. Matt?
Yeah, I have another question, and while I was sitting here and Gowher was describing the experience in South Asia, I was thinking about the New Hampshire that Tom lives in from 100 years ago when we got all the national forests that were denuded landscapes, and now look at them.
Right.
And so there is certainly hope for that, to find a way to connect South Asia and New Hampshire. But what I was wondering, Gowher, I mean, I think from our experience dealing with conservation in the United States, we've actually seen a lot of opportunities for reforestation, for taking out structural barriers for flood control, things like that Do you anticipate a role for philanthropy where you're heading to really serve to reconnect people who, where the old ways of doing things, we may have learned something in this country on how to remediate that, but that philanthropy could play a role, an evolving role.
I'm absolutely sure philanthropy has a big role to play. My point simply was, as yet, because what philanthropy we have is now much more focused on what they consider to be the more pressing issue, that the question of conservation has not been adequately addressed. But there are two other issues to bear in mind. One is the huge population pressure. Bangladesh, for instance, is probably the most densely populated country in the world. Something like 150 million people living in 55,000 square miles. The enormity of the problem is sometimes difficult to imagine. Second thing is, there is a genuine scarcity of resources. So whenever the hope that you could bring some better flood control, better irrigation, etc., are very, very cost intensive, and given both the poverty and the competition for resources, these things have not yet happened as much as. But your point about harnessing traditional wisdom, traditional knowledge, for instance, the people in the southeast of Bangladesh, what is known as the hill tract, where the tribal people live, they have for thousands of years known exactly how to harness their forests. They have a crop, they have what is called a huming system of cultivation, where they cultivate a plot of land and then abandon it for a few years until the soil is regenerated. That was possible as long as the population was small. Now with population explosion, these are becoming difficult.
Now, I have some questions coming in from the audience, and I want to ask the first one, and it's actually a question that I think was initially directed towards Tom, but Gowher, I think you might have something to say about this as well. The question is from Carter Wall, and she asked the following. As we are successful in acquiring land and conservation easements, a new challenge is created, raising money for the management and maintenance of these lands. This strikes me as much more difficult. Has anyone done any work on estimating the needs and what the most promising strategies are for acquiring this funding?
Thank you, Carter, for that question, but I think I'll pass it on to Tom. Tom has
That's a very good question, and I think in the rubric of the Land Trust Alliance, and in our experience, what we try to do, and there is a science and an art behind this, is to reckon the endowment needs of the carrying costs for a parcel of land, the annual stewardship costs, and if it's in the case of an easement, the potential legal costs of defending the easement. That needs to be raised at the same time that the acquisition is raised. The donors need to be just as excited about that as they are about protecting the land. So that's all part of the same campaign. So that as we, and many responsible land trusts know, as we go about a project, we endow that, make that part of the whole business, so that there is essentially a bank account accompanying the parcel of land after it's protected. That's a very important point.
Gowher, let me point the question back at you and just say this. I know that in India, where they're trying to protect tigers, and other parts of Southern Asia, one of the particularly difficult challenges is what do you do with conservation land after the government has drawn a line around that property and said this is protected land? How do you continue to fund rangers and people who try to bring traditional cultures into the management of that? Do you have any insights at all into those problems and how these initiatives might persist for decades and generations?
I think a lot of the government schemes have not been very, very successful. And in fact, what I have argued and I have been arguing is to take these lands outside government management and government control, and to hand it back to the community. Because in many cases it is sad, and I don't want to make wild allegations, but lot of the deforestation has happened through collusion of government foresters and timber merchants. Whereas when community has been given the charge of protecting the land, preserving the land, policing the land, we have seen that felling of trees has declined, plantation has increased, and people use social norms and pressures to make sure that hunting, either the preservation of the animals or of the trees, are done much more effectively. So, once again, I would argue that we should consider involving the community much more than we have done. It is much more cost-effective and indeed much more effective in every way.
Excellent. Okay. We have another question from Milton Puryear. Tom, does your Pew initiative contemplate support for open space, greenways, protected habitat zones, and the like along rivers in urban environments? And I can also make that same question later to Gowher. Is conservation and providing green space in urban areas part of what the agenda needs to be going forward? But first to Tom.
Jim, the answer to that is yes. We're particularly looking at issues along the Hudson River right now, which is a remarkable landscape historically and presently, say between Albany and Wall Street, all the way down. And we've been very fortunate recently to partner with a donor in the protection of a park and along the Hudson River, which in her lifetime had been open to young mothers to take their children to use the beach there. And then over the years there was an industrial site there. It became neglected. The bathhouse was vandalized. And now it's going to be restored fully to a park status with a cooperative venture between a nonprofit organization, Scenic Hudson, and the state and the county governments, and open to a new population of largely people in that community of Terrytown who were from the third world. And so that tradition is going to come back that way. So that's definitely as important from a cultural standpoint. And who knows, perhaps some of these children who learn the value and enjoy from with their mother the experience of the outdoors and the beach will become the conservationists of 30, 40 years from now.
Gowher, can I ask, what role might green space conservation in the very, very rapidly growing urban spaces of the developing world play over coming decades?
I think a consciousness is growing that is extremely important. If you look at cities like Delhi, you will see that although much of the green spaces were actually lost, now the citizens are making a tremendous effort to protect what is left of it. But the tragedy is that if you look at all the cities of a population of more than 5 million, most of these cities are in the developing world. In the developing world, there's a migration from rural to urban areas going on at a rate that it is unimaginable. And so the pressure for housing, expanding slums, and so forth means that gradually these green spaces are being eroded. And governments find it politically very difficult to handle these buildings. Once squatters have actually developed a slump, with the best of intention, it is neither feasible and in many cases not fair to push them out of those. So I will say yes, the problem is serious, consciousness is there, but the result is not very promising.
Very difficult. All right, I will now read a question from Mike Katz, but I want to remind the audience that you have at the bottom of your screen a place to type in questions, and I invite your questions for either one of our guests today. Mike Cass asked the following question for Tom. How do you get reasonable appraisals for landowners, and he particularly is interested in landowners on ranch lands? Now, I know there aren't a lot of ranch lands in New England, but let me ask you to field that question anyway. There are farms, right?
I've got 4 Herefords, so that doesn't qualify as a ranch. That's a good question, and it's part of what the Land Trust Alliance in Washington and the Range Horse operation are looking at right now. The value of a piece of land that is going to be protected and is going to use donated funds for that protection has to be set by a qualified third-party disinterested appraiser. And some of these, of course, are rather unique situations that require a good that there may not be a lot of appraisers that are competent in an area, but I suspect there are enough ranches changing hands so that comps can be reckoned. Obviously, the charity has wants the lowest possible price. Obviously, in most cases, the landowner wants the highest possible price. So it's really important where donated funds are involved that a qualified appraisal is the basis of the transaction. And that's part of the standards and practices of LTA, and we do require those standards and practices are in place on any of the properties we look at.
Let me add to that I know in New England, Keith Ross, who's working closely with the Wildlands and Woodlands Project at the Harvard Forest, is working with the state of Massachusetts to do group appraisals of several properties at the same time. And the state of Massachusetts is actively involved in trying to push that idea along so that the cost per appraisal goes down dramatically. We understand in conservation in New England that the transaction cost can actually provide significant friction to getting these deals done. So any creative way to group these together, because appraisers of course work with comparables, and the comparables can work in a regional way. Any way to group these together and drive the cost of easements down, I think is something that ought to be advanced and experimented with.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. We have a question from Forrest Berkeley, and this is kind of a high-scale question, and I will address it to both of our guests, which is, as you look out over the next 5 to 10 years, what do you see as the largest obstacles to your conservation vision? That is, for Tom, the vision that you have at Pew, and for Gowher, for something that I think you're still in the process of devising as you move to your new position in Dubai. So let me ask Tom first, what are sort of the grand challenges that you see as you go forward over the next 3 to 5 years at Pew?
I think for all of us in this field right now, the biggest challenge is in thinking too small. I think, and in thinking in too parochial ways. I think these things are all connected. I mean, the connection, just listening to Gowher and thinking of the connection of, we're an industrialized part of the world, and we've suffered some of the drawbacks of that, and then we're now starting to learn that we need to change that at a point where the model that we created is now creating enormously greater problems in other parts of the world. Well, these solutions are a group problem, and the work that's done in Bangladesh may illuminate the work that we might be doing here and vice versa. So I would say there are obvious things like lack of funds, lack of personnel, the need for professionals to be professional cadre of people who are good at what they do. But I think the bigger issue is thinking too small is probably the biggest threat right now.
I think Tom is absolutely right. We need to really, really think big, and we need to think indivisibly. In other words, this is not a northern problem or a southern problem. But I think I have two more thoughts on the subject. One is, and these are not, you cannot, when we are talking about conservation, we just cannot simply focus on conservation. We need to address two other issues. One is the question of poverty. Environmental destruction is invariably linked to the question of poverty. So unless we are able to address the question of poverty globally, we will never address the question of conservation. Second, and much more importantly, is we really need to look at our lifestyle. Can we sustain our current level of consumption? I was given the other day a figure that an average American consumes in terms of water, food, energy, 36 times as much an average Bangladeshi does. Is that a level of consumption that we can sustain? Now, of course, so far it was not so bad. Now that China and India are beginning to catch up, if India and China were to reach anywhere the level of consumption that Western Europe and North America has, with 3 billion people joining that level of consumption, I think our fragile planet is in deep trouble. So we really need to address, can we go on this wasteful consumption pattern? It's both philosophical and a practical issue, and we must begin to think about it. Absolutely.
Let me add to that the comment that I heard from a colleague who works at a place called Mercy Corps in the United States, which is the 5th largest development agency, I believe, in the world right now. And Mercy Corps has just, in the last couple of years, started a climate change program. The colleague I'm speaking of is a gentleman named Jim Jarvie, who I believe is Scottish, but works for this organization based in the United States. Mercy Corps has begun to understand that in places as diverse as Mongolia, where there are great deserts that are now expanding and challenging traditional livelihoods, and in urban Jakarta, Indonesia, climate change is going to present aid agencies, particularly relief agencies, with just huge problems. As Gowher said, perhaps a third of Bangladesh is threatened by seawater rise. I've recently read, and I think I have the fraction correct, something like a third of the city of Jakarta, Indonesia, which is a city, I believe, of more than 10 million people, is threatened with the same. So imagine in a place that already is got huge political challenges and civil challenges, faces great hills to climb with regard to sanitation and human health. A third of a city being inundated with water. It's almost too much to contemplate. And yet, organizations like Mercy Corps and USAID and all of the European development agencies are very likely to be faced with exactly these challenges in the next several decades. So it is past time when we begin to think about these kinds of challenges seriously.
Jim, there's another additional dimension to what you are saying. Although Jakarta might go down, 1/3 of Jakarta might go down underwater, but the reality is this will also lead to massive exodus of population. We will, in the years to come, be faced with hundreds of millions of environmental migrants, people who will be fleeing because their land has gone underwater. And that will bring the problem to our own doorstep. So that is why I want to go back to the point that Tom was making. We need to think big, and we need to think together.
I have several more questions from the audience. This one from Keith Bisson, and I think that this is right on the point that we are following right now. How can land conservation organizations better address issues of economic opportunity in rural communities? In Maine, we've had some interesting partnerships with land trusts and community development organizations. Are there more opportunities out there in the United States? Keith Bisson asks, and of course I will extend that question to the rest of the world. Tom, first, how can conservation help to stimulate economic development in rural parts of the United States?
I think that's a very important question, and I think it connects to everything that Gowher was saying. I think even in our past, it's important to, so anyone who reads the history of Maine communities, back 150 years ago when the environment was intact in Maine, people weren't wealthy by any means. A lot of people weren't, but the average person, through working in the timber industry, in a way, it wasn't an industry, it was a business, often a family business. And small families could prosper, could end up sending you read the history of these communities, in these small Maine communities that are now desperate. At that time, in the 1840s and 50s, they would send their children to academies, and a certain percentage of those students found their way to Harvard and into university. And then there was an economic development that happened right up through the Civil War, and there was that connection between the bedrock resources that were managed wisely and the well-being of the communities. When those forests are stripped, then the community is bereft, and there is no economy. There's a local economy that is totally dependent upon summer people, upon catch-penny schemes to make money off of the summer people, which is really not a sustainable model. So I think, I don't think that there is an easy answer. I know that there are some creative issues going on both in Maine and elsewhere to attend to this, but I think the land trust community has got to understand this is part of the whole issue. It's not just the forest, it's the livelihoods of the people around them, and I think that's absolutely true throughout the world.
I entirely agree once again. I mean, I think, this also links to the question of migration and urbanization. Why are people fleeing from the rural areas? Population increase means there's greater pressure on the land, and people who do not have land or cannot work the land are moving to the urban areas. And what is required in a massive way is to find alternate livelihoods in non-farming areas, so that people can remain in rural areas and continue to have a livelihood. That's in fact a doable proposition. It is not a difficult thing. It's a very simple thing. Microcredit finance has been one great innovation, which has enabled many people to develop micro-enterprise and yet remain in the rural areas rather than swamping the urban areas and producing further degradation. So there are areas, there are ways in which it can be done. I really think we need to be more serious about it.
Thank you, Gowher, for bringing the conversation back to conservation finance, which is where we started with your answer about microfinance. I have one final question before we conclude our hour here, which I think has been very productive and thought-provoking. It's a question that comes from Ed DeVenny at the New England Forestry Foundation, and it is, again, a question for the panel, and I will chip in on this one as well. Where do you think the majority of funding for new forest conservation projects will come from in the next 5 years and beyond?
I would say that it's going to be from a variety of sources, and we need to be open to a variety of sources. Some of it may come from new forest owners who decide that they want to own land and manage it intelligently. Some of it may come from land issues from the states. Some of it may come from land trusts and private philanthropists. Some of it may come from even federal money. So I think we have to be adept at looking at financing in a big picture, and remember that the landowner sector in the Northeast, and that includes Pennsylvania and New York, 90% of the undeveloped land, more than that, is in private hands. So we have to look at the economy of these issues as well as we pursue our idealistic goals.
I think Tom has given us a good list of where the resources will come. My personal, in addition to that, my personal preference would be that we need to think of raising money which will also encourage people to change their habits. And one of the areas we need to think about is pollution taxes, consumption taxes, so that we not only are able to raise money for the environment, but we will also encourage people to change their behavior so that our footprint on this planet becomes a little bit lighter.
Matt Zyper has raised his hand and wants to contribute to the conversation. Matt.
Thanks, Jim. Just one follow-up point on this issue of where's funding going to come from. The Trust for Public Land has been tracking public spending on land conservation in the United States over the past, we have a database, landvote.org, that over the past 20 years, voters have voted to raise their own taxes across the country, $46 billion. So private philanthropy plays a critical role in both stimulating public investment. But public investment on its own is enormous. Your local town, your county, your state, voters are consistently willing to reach into their pockets for things they care about, and I see no reason that won't continue. And I think the philanthropic community can play a huge role in both encouraging local governments in the United States and overseas to continue to do that.
And let me finally throw my 2 cents in. Every crisis, particularly in the conservation and environmental field, brings a new opportunity. The crisis of the generation that is now coming to power in the United States and throughout the world certainly has global warming integrally woven into it. And we have an opportunity both in the United States and in other places around the world to create a global market for carbon and carbon sequestration. Certainly, if carbon trading is something that is widespread over the next several decades, there could be an enormous amount of economic opportunity and incentive for people from the Amazon to India to the Northeast United States to get actively involved both in forest conservation and the stewardship of those forests. So I think that's an opportunity, particularly in the area of conservation finance, that we have to look forward to. Now let me close today's session by thanking our guests. I think that they've done a wonderful job at covering the landscape, so to speak. Let me thank Matt Zeiper for doing a tremendous amount of work in the background, both interviewing Tom Curren and helping put today's session together. Lizzie Reardon, who is my research assistant and who is also sitting at this table, has been our collective memory and has helped us to put all of this together, as has Jim Cooney, who is our technical wizard. So to all of you and to the 70-plus of you who have stayed for an hour to listen to this conversation, my huge thanks, my enthusiasm for everything that all of you are doing, and my invitation to all of you to join us again in about 3 months for our next session. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.